I'm just going to say a very few brief words by way of introduction, and then I'm going to hand over to Johnny Mundy of the IF project, and of course to Brian. So welcome to Senate House, and welcome to the School of Advanced Study. It's a fitting venue, I think, for this talk, because we are in the building which used to be the Ministry of Information during the war, and there's also the inspiration for George Orwell's Ministry of Truth in 1984. So it's a very fitting venue to be talking about the news and being human. My name's Michael Leeds. I work in the School of Advanced Study, and I'm also the curator of the Being Human Festival of the Humanities, which is, we have a few banners and a few flyers up for the festival. It's a new festival launching this year, which is geared towards building public understanding of humanities research and basically trying to break down divides between universities and communities and people. So the event taking place today has been organised by the school in collaboration with the IF project, which is an incredibly exciting initiative, I think. And when I heard about the IF project, which is trying to use the cultural resources of London to create a free university, I thought that mirrored what we're trying to do both with the festival and in the School of Advanced Study itself. So the school is the National Centre for Research, Facilitation and Promotion in the Humanities, and we hold over 2,000 public events every year, so of which this is one. Okay, so I won't say too much more, but just to draw your attention to the fact that although this is one event in London, the Being Human Festival of the Humanities is a national festival, and we have over 150 free events going on right across the country, hosted by over 50 universities and their community and cultural partners. Do have a look at our programme, which you can see online at www.beinghumanfestival.org. And follow us on Twitter. We're at beinghumanfest, and the hashtag is beinghuman14 if any of you have phones or other electronic devices on you and want to tweet during this lecture or any of our other events. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Johnny, who will introduce Brian. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Michael. That's great. Hi, I'm Johnny Mundy, co-founder of the IF project. Formal thanks to Michael and to School of Advanced Studies. It's brilliant to be part of this year's Being Human Festival. And I realise you're all here to hear Brian speak, so I will be as brief as I can. But before I introduce Brian, I'll take this opportunity to tell you just a little bit more about the IF project. IF is an initiative in alternative higher education where the courses are free, lecturers donate time and expertise, and the syllabus includes taking in the many events in the cultural institutions around London. We are creating a community of those who want to teach and those who want to learn for the love of doing so. And when I say courses, the IF project aims to provide short, inspiring introductory courses in humanities subjects at about year one undergraduate level for young people who, for a variety of reasons, don't want to or can't take up the traditional high-cost higher education route. Our pilot course we ran in the summer was a 4-week humanities, part-time humanities summer school, and we want to build on that, and we're intending to develop a range of courses, all free to students in 2015 and 16. But as a community that relies on the enthusiasm of teachers and students, we invite you to get in touch if you're interested in the project, whether interested in teaching, learning, or just being kept up to date. You have a flyer with our details on your seat, so we'd love to hear from you. But now to the real reason we're here. One of the reasons the IF project believes the humanities education is so worthwhile is because the humanities give us critical tools to analyse everyday institutions like the news. And we're delighted that Professor Catchcart is here to do just that this evening. Really pleased he could lecture And for those who aren't aware of his bio, Professor Catchcart is Professor of Journalism at Kingston University, London. He was co-founder of the Hacked Off campaign and was director initially, and is the author of several erudite but also popular books, including Were You Still Up for Portillo? And The Case of Stephen Lawrence. His latest book, which this lecture draws from, is The News from Waterloo, and that is, I think, it's relevant to say, published in spring 2015 by Faber and Faber. But for now, it's my pleasure to introduce Brian himself to speak.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Michael and Johnny. From sitting there, I was trying to decide whether I was more grateful to the people I dragooned into coming, or the people I had put placed no pressure on at all. And I don't know what the answer is. As some of you know, I spent a lot of time lately on press self-regulation. This is, as you can tell, something different. Although, maybe not something completely different. I was researching the book, I couldn't help noticing little indicators here and there. For example, in the year of Waterloo, the editor of The Times was sacked for refusing to print news that didn't suit his opinions. Now, would that happen today? I also came across what might well be the ultimate example of editorial accountability. The man who edited the Morning Post in 1815 would later be murdered at his desk, apparently by an angry reader. I can promise you that no one at Hacked Off has ever suggested murdering editors, at least not in public. Now, Waterloo and being human. When I began trying to reconstruct the story of how the news of Waterloo reached London, I didn't have being human in mind, you won't be surprised here, but well, I thought it would be a good and interesting yarn. In fact, it made me think about people and our behaviour around news, then and now. Some contrasts, some similarities. And so I was very pleased when Barbara and indeed Michael and Johnny offered to give me a chance to talk about these things. I'd like to start with a little maths, so brace yourselves. The Battle of Waterloo was over at 9 p.m. on a Sunday evening. It had been pretty evenly contested for most of the day, but by 9 p.m. nobody could be in any doubt that the French were beaten. The first reliable word of this, of the victory, reached Westminster in London on Wednesday night, just after 11 o'clock. So, Sunday at 9 to Wednesday at 11. That's an interval of 3 days and 2 hours. You're not going to have to do a sum at the end of this. The distance from the battlefield to central London, measured along the roads, was something like 165 miles. The sea crossing, 70 miles. Shuffle all those numbers in a calculator and you find that the average speed at which the news of Wellington's victory travelled was about 3 miles per hour. That's normal human walking speed. Now, this was a victory that brought to an end 25 years of war. It was, I would say, the most momentous news to reach London in the whole of the 19th century. So when information that important travels so slowly, it's reasonable to ask why. And the first temptation is to think, those poor devils back then, they didn't have smartphones and Twitter, they didn't even have steamships and steam railways. In fact, they were relying on the same communications technologies used by the Romans 15 centuries earlier. That's horsepower, sail power. No wonder things moved slowly. But that's not really fair, because they weren't stuck in a rut. Historians write of this period as one of transport revolution. And the people of the time believed they were living in an age of dazzling, even terrifying speed. There's a story about a young lawyer, John Campbell, in Edinburgh, who announces to his family that he's going to take one of the new fast stagecoaches to London. The consternation. Relatives warn him that this is terribly bad for your health. Stories were told, he later wrote, of men and women who, having reached London with such celerity, died suddenly of an affection of the brain. So Campbell was told, at the very least, to break his journey at York, so he could recover his equilibrium. He ignored this, and he made the journey as planned. Now, I can't say whether his brain was affected. He did go on to be Lord Chief Justice. So, the point is, I suppose, that people really believed they were living in an age of... They weren't in a rut. And by 1815, the stagecoaches were getting quicker, the roads, the horses, the sailing ships were all improving too. So those stagecoaches were capable, on a good day, of 8 or 9 miles per hour. And that puts in context that Waterloo speed of 3 miles per hour. Our news didn't just travel slowly by our standards, it travelled slowly by the standards of the people at that time. It was moving at less than the speed that was reasonably possible. So, this isn't just about machines and technologies, or the lack of them. Nor, for that matter, is it about the weather. We'll come to that. The weather certainly has a part to play. It's also about human beings and the choices they made. Now, in a general way, I would say that the business of news is driven by 2 human desires. The desire to know what's happened, and the desire to pass that knowledge on to others. And the strength of those desires gives the whole business its urgency. So we want to know as soon as possible. And we can't wait to tell others. We can't wait to be the ones to tell others. And these desires are generally so powerful in modern society that I suspect many of us think of them as instinctive. Getting and spreading news comes naturally to us. It's part, you might say, of being human. And 3 miles an hour is a bit of a challenge to that idea. Were people so different then? Did they simply not feel that urgency? That would be interesting, not least because it would suggest that our behaviour around news today is more learned than instinctive. Or was there something about society in 1815 that caused this? Did the speed of news simply matter less? That's also an intriguing idea. Now, happily, the very slowness of these events in that week after Waterloo helps. It's like an action replay. So frame by frame, we can observe who did what and when in the various stages of transmission. So let's start with the Duke of Wellington. So this is a Goya portrait. It's quite close to the time of Waterloo, and it catches him in a pose, I think, different from his usual sort of carapace of loftiness, slightly worried. Now, as I say, by 9 p.m. Wellington knew that Napoleon had been beaten. He'd made sure, by riding out with the pursuing forces, to see the French retreat for himself. On his way back, he encountered Blücher, the Prussian commander, and they acknowledged the victory to each other as their allies. Here is the famous painting of that by Maclise. It's, the full painting is 50 feet long, and it's a great monument to the sort of Victorian cult of Waterloo. It's full of, impeccably researched, full of faces. Alas, Wellington ruined everything by saying that the meeting didn't actually happen at La Belle Alliance, somewhere else. This is the absolute centre of the picture. Now, after this meeting, so sometime after 9 o'clock, we might expect Wellington to get the news on its way. He'd been writing notes all day, sending orders across the battlefield. Now, surely, he'd write a few lines to London announcing the victory. He knew that the government was desperate for news. And then there was his wife, Kitty, who was at home in London and would surely have been keen to know that he was safe. But he wrote no message to London then or at any time that night, nor did he authorise anyone else to do it, and no other officer in his army took the initiative either. That's not like 2015. So why? Well, like many others that evening, Wellington was in a state of shock. The slaughter had been appalling by any standards. Bloodshed per square yard, the Battle of Waterloo is said to bear comparison with Passion Day. Now, Wellington had given the orders, he watched it all unfold, and in the gloom that night he rode back to his headquarters through scenes out of nightmares. "My heart is broken," he would say later. When he reached his headquarters, an inn in Waterloo Village, it was to find an old friend, a staff officer, comrade in arms, dying of his wounds, and he stopped to comfort him. Then he had a quiet, gloomy supper with a few officers and diplomats, and went to bed. No one else took responsibility for the news. In the military convention of the time, informing London was the responsibility, the privilege, the duty of the commanding officer and no one else. No one would dare. The news had to be sent in the form of a formal dispatch, giving a full account of developments, naming the names, those famous mentions in dispatches. It's not something you could scribble on horseback, nor knock off in half an hour. So, on the night of the battle, the news simply sat where it was. At 3:30 a.m., Wellington was woken up. An officer arrived requiring orders. And indeed, his friend had died. He had breakfast, tea and toast, we're told, and with the sun coming up, he began writing his dispatch. So it's a picture by his niece painted some drawing sometime later, and that's his draft of the dispatch, which is in the British Library. So he started to write. 7 hours have passed since the battle ended. Before long, he breaks off and he rides into Brussels where he's required. That's 12 miles away. There, over the next few hours, he finishes the manuscript and he gives it to the clerks to make tidy copies suitable for delivery to London. Now, this picture of an unhurried commander is borne out in the actual words. The dispatch runs to 2,400 words and is written as a narrative beginning 3 days before Waterloo. So you've read almost half of it before the fighting begins. The action itself is dashed off in 400 words, and most of the rest of it is a sort of despairing account of the casualties. There isn't a hint of urgency or excitement. Nowhere does Wellington use the word victory or triumph or anything like that. In fact, it's little wonder that when the American ambassador in London eventually saw the dispatch, he thought it was describing a defeat and not a victory. Now, to carry this dispatch to London, Wellington chose an aide-de-camp, the Honourable Major Henry Percy, the son of the Earl of Beverley and the grandson of the Duke of Northumberland. Here he is. This is from a miniature of about that size, so it's not just a reproduction full. Percy's 29 years old. He's tall, dark, handsome, muscular, conspicuously charming, brave, all of this, and that's the only image of him. And indeed, they're not terribly sure about that. It's one of the striking things about a family. So this came to me when researching in Alnwick, the home of the Percy family. And when a family's been so prominent for so long, they may have many interesting characters in their history, but some of them quite easily get lost. There are several Henrys, so you have to plough your way through Henry, and there's only one possible picture of him. It's all a great pity because I rather fell for him. His uniform was still stained with blood from the battlefield, he had had very little sleep, like Wellington, over the past 3 days. He'd been to the famous ball before Waterloo, and now he received his package of letters and his orders from Wellington, and he bade farewell to his colleagues and stepped into the carriage that was to take him to the coast. Why a carriage? Why not simply ride? Well, for one thing, a light carriage drawn by 4 horses over decent roads was normally quicker. And for another, he had baggage. He was under orders from Wellington to convey to London and lay before the Prince Regent the 2 great trophies captured in the battle. Imperial eagles. I don't vouch for the picture, but that's an image that shows you what it was like. And that's one of the eagles, one of the captured eagles. That is the one, I think, in the National Army Museum. They're impressive objects. So the eagles at the top, they have copper, gilded copper, and they weigh about 2.5 pounds apiece. They come with a 10-foot oak pole and a flag, heavy flag trimmed in gold, a tricolour trimmed in gold. One of them was broken, and they were stained with blood and mud. Even if Henry Percy could have travelled without a carriage, they couldn't have done. So what time is it by now? Henry's in his carriage, he's got his eagles, he's got his dispatch. What time is it? Well, he can't have set out before 1 p.m. on Monday. In other words, 16 hours had passed before the battle ended. In that time, the news had covered just 12 miles, and that's out of 235 to London. So it raises an obvious practical question on all this. If the army wasn't in a hurry, and it plainly wasn't, surely somebody else was. After all, there must have been plenty of independent people in Brussels, in Belgium, who weren't subject to army regulations and who could take steps to get the news to London much faster than this. Now this brings us, and it will be as fleeting as I can manage it, to a well-known legend. It has long been claimed that this man, Nathan Rothschild, the founder of the bank, N.M. Rothschild and Son, was the first person in London to know about Waterloo, and indeed it's claimed that he cunningly turned his knowledge into a fortune on the stock exchange. The most reputable historians, and I'm thinking, for example, of Elizabeth Longford, Wellington's biographer, have paid lip service to this story, and it has a remarkable life online, if you care to delve into it. Now, Rothschild was a great man in many ways, but this story is simply not true. He wasn't the first to know, and he didn't make a fortune. The evidence just isn't there, and the story is discredited in other ways too. It's a kind of chameleon, a shapeshifter. It's one of those theories that adopts whatever form is required to avoid being conclusively disproved. And it's also heavily tainted by anti-Semitism. It's such a perfect collage of racist stereotypes that the Nazis made a propaganda movie out of it. If you go onto neo-Nazi websites, you can see this to this day, shares in Waterloo. That's cool. So let's leave Rothschild. It's possible to identify 2 real independent lines of communication stretching to London. That's to say, outside the realm of the army. But the first of them belongs in a file marked the fog of war. It goes like this. 2 days before Waterloo, Wellington fought a lesser battle against the French, that's known as Catchcart. Many fewer soldiers were involved, and although it was bloody, it was generally reckoned to have been a draw. At that time, the authorities in Brussels were coping with a public panic. People were terrified that Napoleon's army was about to storm the city. And in that context, the news of a draw at Catchcart wasn't thought to be good enough. So instead, the population was encouraged to think that Wellington's army had won a victory. The French, it was announced, had been repulsed far beyond the battlefield. In reality, they'd withdrawn a couple of miles in good order and made camp and were ready to attack the next day. So that bit of spin, that claim of victory when there wasn't one, ripples slowly out from Brussels. And as it travels, it improves with the telling. So on the Sunday evening, a soldier turns up at Ostend on the North Sea coast with a story that the French were in headlong retreat back over the border into France after being thumped. Now, to be absolutely clear, this is not the news of Waterloo. So I'm really misunderstanding about this. Waterloo was coming to an end at about that time, but it was 80 or 90 miles away and nobody in Ostend could possibly have known anything about it. This was simply a misleading account of a preliminary encounter a couple of days earlier. As luck would have it, hanging around on the Ostend docks that night, picture of the Ostend docks, was an Englishman by the name of Daniel Sutton. Sutton heard the story and decided to take action. Daniel Sutton is something of a Mr. Toad. He's ostensibly respectable. He's the town clerk of Colchester, no less. But in reality, he's a reckless, faddish character who likes nothing better than squandering his inherited fortune and messing about in boats. He's done some idle sailing in his time. He's done some smuggling. And now he has turned his hand to ferrying soldiers and military hardware between Colchester and Ostend. On hearing this report of a French defeat, I repeat, a mistaken report of a French defeat, Sutton sails immediately for Colchester. As soon as he gets there, he takes the first available coach to London. There he presents himself at the offices of the Morning Post on the Strand. So it's now battle on Sunday, Monday. It's now 5 a.m. on Tuesday morning. London is in a complete state of ignorance about what's happening in Belgium. It's days behind. The Post ditched its dull first edition, promptly began printing a second, in which Sutton's story was reported with all the fanfare that could be mustered. I would love to show it to you, actually, but the edition simply doesn't seem to have survived. I can get plenty of copies of the old dull edition that was ditched, presumably that's why. But the Sutton edition is simply not to be found, or at least I haven't found. But from other papers, we know that it boldly announced a great victory for Wellington, which left Bonaparte's army fleeing for the border, and we know it caused a sensation. Two little clippings. Town put into the highest state of exaltation in the Morning Post. The bottom one is from a Stamford Mercury. On Tuesday at an early hour, the metropolis was thrown into a state of extraordinary agitation. It took about 12 hours before convincing proof reached London that Sutton's story was wrong, and another 12 hours before that was generally acknowledged. It's a great example of the truth putting its boots on while the lie is halfway around the world. Now, we'll leave Sutton there. I said there were two lines of communication that were independent of army influence. The second, as it happens, begins with Wellington. Now, I told you that on the night before the night of the battle, the Duke went to bed without so much as scribbling a note. What I didn't say was that over supper, he was persuaded to authorize someone else to write, not to London, but to the King of France. This was Louis XVIII. Louis le Désiré, the desired one. So he's the younger brother of the Louis who had been guillotined. And when Waterloo was being fought, he was in Ghent, in the Belgian city of Ghent, waiting while his fate was decided. So one of the diplomats at Wellington's table undertook to inform Louis of the outcome of the matter. He rode into Brussels in the darkness and wrote a letter, which he gave to a French royalist officer, who took it to Ghent. This messenger probably reached Louis at about 9 o'clock on the Monday morning. And the king, delighted, soon shared the news with his little court, and a party began. And the people of Ghent joined in. So there's a kind of street party going on. And here we bump into another stray Englishman. These celebrations were witnessed by somebody who has come down to us identified only as Mr. C of Dover. Mr. C immediately resolved to go to London with the intention, as one newspaper report put it, of being the first bearer of the great news. He left Ghent, it seems, at around 1 p.m. on Monday, and he caught a ship that same night from Ostend. So just to illustrate, so you go to Ghent, and then Eeklo, and then Bruges, and then Ostend, and then so when he reached London, we can't say precisely, but it was sometime during the night of Tuesday to Wednesday. So if you think Sutton had arrived at 5 a.m. on Tuesday morning, Mr. C arrives sometime on the night of Tuesday to Wednesday. And by then London is in a state, so Sutton's news has caused great excitement, and then the contrary reports are sinking in. Two items from the papers illustrate the mood. And the first is this from the Morning Herald. Groups of people remain to a late hour on Strand, some arguing for one, some for another construction. Horse guards, the crowd is greater, parts from people waiting in the Stratton. And these are the places. So the Strand is where we say Fleet Street, but in fact most of the papers were on the Strand in those days. Horse guards in the park is where the government is. This is where they expect the news to be. And they're thronging all evening. The other is another example of me living halfway around the world. This is from the Morning Chronicle. I can show you the digitized, as it were, copy of the digitized version of this, but the other one isn't digitized yet, so we have to wait for it. But this is Chronicle talking about the stories of victory. So at Covent Garden, the following account of it was read from the stage. There's a rang with shouts of joy. Lord Cranbourne suddenly, after Salisbury, just arrived from the headquarters of Duke of Wellington in the Catchcart to feed Bonaparte. This is all nonsense. Lord Cranbourne was in fact at another theatre that night across town. He had not been in Belgium at all. It's just nonsense. Where it came from, I don't know. It was also appeared in another paper. So I take it as a symptom of hysteria, to be honest. And what's more, a symptom of the papers not covering themselves with great glory. There we are. Now, no one in all of this, no one in London was more anxious than the government. And the government had effectively bet the farm on Wellington achieving a victory, an early victory, over Napoleon. They had raised, among other things, the largest loan ever raised by a British government to date to pay for the army in Belgium. So when Sutton had turned up and told his story, ministers had been all too eager to believe it, and a couple of them actually made slight fools of themselves over it. Now, they knew Sutton's information was wrong, and they were more anxious than ever. So enter Mr. C. He first surfaces in the City of London on Wednesday morning, apparently telling his story to anybody who will listen. By noon, the newspapers are reporting the tale that he told about the news reaching the French king at Ghent. Now the trouble was, we know that Mr. C's information was accurate. We know that Mr. C was actually really the first person to arrive in London with real news of the victory, of Wellington's victory at Waterloo. But they didn't. They didn't know its provenance. Nobody in London did. And they'd already been led astray once. So even the most excitable newspapers treated this information with great caution. This is the Courier, a pretty excitable newspaper. And they say, the following is said to have been brought by a gentleman. We give it as we heard it, repeating, however, down to the hour. We give it as we heard it. Here, have this in tongs. It is, they couldn't distance themselves much further without not publishing it. What was needed, what was quite clear from this, what it was needed now was the dispatch. So where is Percy? Well, we last saw him leaving Brussels by carriage on Monday. The next sighting is at 2 p.m. the following day, the Tuesday, when he boards a ship at Ostend. So it seems that he took 25 hours to cover the 75 or so miles to the coast. That is our familiar speed of 3 miles per hour. And remember, a carriage pulled by 4 horses could, if pushed, do 8 or 9 miles an hour in decent conditions. So what's going on? The road to the coast, pardon me if we talk about roads for a moment, was a very good one, at least by the standards of 1815. A lot of it was dead straight and paved in stone. British travellers who rode this route raved about it. Okay? And we have a glimpse of it. Well, we can see it. This is an absolutely fabulous map by somebody called Ferraris from the late 18th century. And it may well have been the map used by Percy. There were 2 around, this may have been the one. And you can see this is the road. There it is. Nice and straight, lined with trees. You know, what more could you ask? And there's even scenery. Look at that. He passes that. That's actually a gibbet. And you actually see there's somebody hanging from it. So this road it has 3 carriageways, of which the middle one is solidly paved all the way. Now the outer lanes are for light traffic, and they also allow passing. Let's say, and it's likely, that those outer lanes have taken a bit of a battering over the preceding weeks from military vehicles. And let's say also, let's allow that there had been an apocalyptic rainstorm on the eve of Waterloo, and this had made this much worse. So the road may have been down to 1 lane for some stretches, but 1 paved lane. Allow too that on that particular Monday it was probably very busy, with refugees fleeing from Brussels in one direction and British reinforcements coming up, including a whole siege train from Ostend, in the other. So some hold-ups, some delays, for sure. As I say, I like Percy, I'm going to make allowances for it. My other excuse is that along much of the route, he was the first with the news, so he'll have been stopped many times, especially by British soldiers, officers, and there were lots of them either in billets or on the move. So he'd been stopped and been asked about the battle and who lived and who'd been killed and so forth. And some of them, I suspect, might have wanted him to join them in raising a glass or 2. British officers at the time were no strangers to that. And if he wanted to slip by, if he really wanted to avoid them, it would have been difficult. Because remember, he's travelling with 2 great big enemy flags sticking out of his carriage windows. Now this is the nearest we have to a picture. It's slightly hard to make out, but that is actually his carriage coming towards us. These are his horses here in the foreground. So it's sort of turning a corner. And there are the 2 flags. I don't know if the person who drew this actually saw it, but whatever. So, delays, likely. But let's not get stuck on the road like him. On Tuesday afternoon, he sails from Ostend. Now, HMS Peruvian was a fast ship. It was known for a particular chase of an American privateer, which he captured. And Percy probably had hopes of making up time. It wasn't to be. So the wind was light when they sailed, and soon it died altogether. They drifted on the current. The current happened to be taking them the right way, but very, very slowly. Now this was a crossing that with luck could be done in 8 hours. By Wednesday morning they'd done twice that, and the Peruvian was still drifting, and there was no wind and no sight of England. As a newspaper would later report, Percy was in a state of anxiety. 8 o'clock came, 9 o'clock came, 10 o'clock. Still the same. In London, meanwhile, Mr. C is telling his story, a true and accurate one to be now, but one that people can trust. Now, the Peruvian, in the words of the ancient mariner, is as idle as a painted ship upon a painted ocean. Around 11 o'clock, there's a shout from the rigging, land. In the distance is a sight familiar to sailors. Now, this is the North Foreland Light. It's on the northeastern tip of Kent. That's what it looks like today, top of the cliff. So when they see this, when they're told it's there, something snaps. The captain of the Peruvian, who's also feeling the pressure, made a suggestion. Percy eagerly accepted. A small boat is lowered over the side. 4 sailors board it, and Percy, the captain, the eagles follow. They're going to row the rest of the way. So this is 15 or 20 miles, and it takes about 4 hours. They beach the boat at Broadstairs, hire a post-chaise and 4, the taxi of the time, and they set out for London. Now, at last, they're getting up speed. So, Broadstairs. They're changing horses at Canterbury, Sittingbourne, Rochester, Dartford, and heading towards London. They're achieving something like 9 miles per hour, and they're having to stop at turnpikes and, as I say, for the changes of horses, so it's impressive. But still, it's 10 p.m. before they catch their first sight of London in the distance. That's from the crest of Shooters Hill. So what's been happening in London? The Observer, that weekend, and it was being published back then, would later describe Wednesday as an interval of painful suspense. After Mr. C's arrival and the uncertain reception of his news, other reports trickle into town. Napoleon, say some, has captured Brussels. No, sailors, Wellington has triumphed. And the very absence of the official dispatch is adding to the tension. If there'd been a battle on Sunday, as there seemed to have been, why had Wellington not reported? Was he dead? Was he rallying his defeated army? Or was he busy driving the defeated French towards Paris? The desperation for the dispatch drives the Sun, an evening paper, to publish this stop press item. And the public is looking with so much impatience. Well, that's what stopping the press for. In fact, I found a book by a celebrated comedian at the time, Charles Matthew, from a couple of years later, in which he's still making a joke about this very item. He has a sort of riff about the press, and he refers to this. Anyway, finally, at 11:15, Percy's carriage crosses Westminster Bridge and is greeted by a jubilant throng of people, still out and about at 11:15. He makes for Downing Street, where the War Department is, and the officials there are manning their desks for the second night running. They've been put on special duty, and this is the second night running. But the dispatch has to be delivered to the War Secretary in person. And unfortunately, he's not at his desk. He's at dinner. So, with this chanting crowd close behind, Percy sets off for Grosvenor Square. By chance, it was the evening of the monthly cabinet dinner, and this was taking place at the home of the Lord President of the Council, Lord Harrowby. Ministers were very grateful. By now they were clinging to each other for comfort, afraid to let go in case they weren't there when the news arrived. And one description of the evening goes like this. They dined. They sat. No dispatch came. At length, when the night was far advanced, they broke up. Yet, delayed by a lingering hope that the expected messenger might appear, they stood a while in a knot, conversing on the pavement. And suddenly, they heard a faint and distant shout. It was the shout of victory, hurrah! Escorted by a running and vociferous multitude, the Major drove up. He was taken into the house and the dispatch was opened. It took, and I've described it, it took the ministers some time to absorb from Wellington's prose the nature of the news and the scale of the victory. But at length, they worked it out. By then, the crowd outside was getting restless, so someone was sent out to let them know what the dispatch reported. And the result, reported the Morning Post, was universal and ecstatic cheering. But the climactic moment had yet to come. The dispatch and the eagles had to be delivered to the Prince Regent. There he is as he saw himself. There he is as the cartoonist saw him. Actually, that's relatively generous. The Prince was dining that night with friends at the St James's Square home of a retired banker, Edmund Burn, and his wife, Dorothy. So up in Grosvenor Square, everyone piles into their carriages, not forgetting the eagles, and with this crowd still in tow, they set off in a noisy procession. At the Burns, the dinner is over, and there's to be dancing. Dorothy would later describe the scene. The first quadrille was in the act of forming, and the Prince was walking up to the dais on which his seat was placed, when I saw everyone, without the slightest sense of decorum, rushing to the windows. The music ceased, and the dance was stopped, for we heard nothing but the vociferous shouts of an enormous mob, who had just entered the square and were running by the side of a post-chaise and four, out of whose windows were hanging 3 nasty French eagles. She means 2. In a second, the door of the carriage was flung open, and without waiting for the steps to be let down, out sprang Henry Percy. Such a dusty figure, with a flag in each hand, pushing aside everyone who happened to be in his way, darting upstairs into the ballroom, stepping hastily up to the Regent, dropping on one knee, laying the flags at his feet and pronouncing the words, "Victory, sir, victory." Mrs. Byrne remembered the room clearing in less than 20 minutes. Even the band had gone, she said. Not only without uttering a word of apology, but even without taking a mouthful to eat. Ladies of the highest rank rushed away like maniacs in their muslins and satin shoes across the square, some accompanied by gentlemen, others without escort of any kind. And so began 3 days of celebrations in London, while at the same time the news travelled across the country by stagecoach. Now that's, it's a sort of, there's a great tradition of the coaches carrying news around the country. They're sort of like rolling billboards with flags and generally decked in laurels and that sort of thing. Because Wellington had won a long succession of victories, this was a sort of quite a well-rehearsed means of communication. A couple of headlines. And I should say that everywhere the joy of the victory was also mixed with the shock of the really terrible casualties, and the list was very long. Prince Regent that night at the Burns wept when the list was read to him. But this was to be one of those where were you when moments, right up to the end of the 19th century and even into the 20th, when somebody really old died, it would often be noted that they had remembered hearing the news of Waterloo. So, that's the narrative. That's the sort of slow motion case study. What does all this muddle and confusion tell us? And what does it tell us about humans? Well, we've seen enough to know that the news instinct was just as strong in 1815 as it is today. Daniel Sutton knew a story when he heard that, even if it wasn't true. Mr. C wanted to be the first bearer of the great news. The management of Covent Garden Theatre, though again they had the wrong end of the stick, couldn't resist interrupting the show to thrill the audience with news. The crowds milling about in the streets 2 nights running were there for news. And perhaps the most vivid example is those aristocratic ladies in their muslins and satin shoes throwing decorum to the women, rushing out across St James's Square to tell their families and friends what they'd seen. News, with all its urgency and excitement, was as much a part of being human then as it is for us. And the fact that they were kept waiting so long is also a human thing too. It can't simply be put down to communications technology. Yes, the sea crossing was painfully slow, but in fact it added fewer hours to the transmission of the news than Wellington did. Nor, in my view, can we blame that slow journey across Belgium entirely, or even mainly, on the roads. People bear a good deal of the responsibility. So look again at Wellington. He sat on the news for 16 hours, and then, when he finally sent Percy on his way, he lumbered him with the Eagles, which surely guaranteed further delay. So maybe Wellington didn't have the news chip. Maybe he lacked the instinct. Well, we have compelling evidence to the contrary. I mentioned that he showed no urgency about communicating with his wife in London. So Kitty worshipped him. And we can be sure she was extremely anxious to hear he was safe. But he would hardly have spared Kitty a thought. He didn't love her. He regarded her as an embarrassment. There was, however, somebody he did feel impelled to write to. And look at the time, 8:30 in the morning on Monday the 19th. So that's as soon as he reaches Brussels and before he picks up the dispatch to complete it. It's the first thing he does when he gets to Brussels. My dear Lady Frances, Mount Norris is her father. Yesterday after that. So, that's her, Frances Wedderburn Webster. She's the wife of an army officer, and at that time she is the apple of Wellington's eye. The famous Duchess of Richmond ball. He scandalises people by how much time he spends talking to her. She's in the advanced stages of pregnancy at the time as well. The relationship would later provoke a libel case, where Wellington denied ever having been alone in a room with her. But the letter was interesting for reasons other than, breach of privacy. It's an urgent communication of news. It's expressed in pithy terms. It comes complete with that word victory. I have gained a complete victory. Wellington could do it when he chose. If he wanted to write a note passing on news, he could. He did it here. He just didn't choose to do it when he was informing London. Why not? Well, he wouldn't personally have given a damn about any anxiety suffered by the government or the public in London or the press. He didn't have much regard for any of them. And he also wanted control of the narrative. His actions over subsequent decades show that he was determined that the story of Waterloo should be told his way. And in a more general sense, we know that military establishments always want the government and the public to hear their version of what's happened. They wanted that version out there first, and they wanted to dominate. The price of that in 1815 may have been confusion and suspense and anxiety, but the outcome was a wonder of news management. The story of Waterloo that swept the country. Here is Wilkie's famous picture of the Waterloo Dispatch being read to Chelsea pensioners. This was such a popular picture that they when it was unveiled, I think in 1819, they were queuing around the block to see it. It's a wonder of news management. And that dispatch remained the dominant narrative for a generation. People learned it by heart. But there's more here than a story of news management. Because something's missing, and it's something quite big. Look again at Wellington. He moves at his own pace because he can. He has no rival with the news. Nobody to put him under pressure. Yes, there's Daniel Sutton and there's Mr. C and people like that who are independent and free and ready to rush to London with their stories. But they're random, they're unknown, they have no authority. They don't worry about it. The rival that's missing here is journalism. London in 1815 had lots of journalism. Newspapers were very well established over decades, and they were part of the city's life. There were morning papers and evening papers and Sunday papers and midweek papers and twice-weekly papers and 3 times weekly papers. All together, and remarkably, there were more than 50 titles in London alone. But not one of them sent a reporter to Brussels to cover the war. No journalist had been given the very simple job, seems to me, the obvious job, should I say, of going to Belgium, establishing who won the battle, and ensuring that some kind of decent report of it reached London by the swiftest possible means. Now, it's true that the newspapers at that time were small and poor. On the other hand, they were competitive, and this was a very big story. It wasn't all that expensive to get somebody to Brussels, and the title that published the news first would have a big scoop. It's also true that newspapers were subject to a great range of official restraints, and that their communications from abroad, for example, were habitually obstructed by the post office, notably. But the evidence of Sutton and Mr. C shows that a reporter could have made the journey, or sent a message with somebody else. It would even have been possible for a reporter to observe the battle directly. There's a story that in the heat of the fighting, Wellington found himself in conversation with a button manufacturer from Birmingham, who was there as a tourist. I would guess, it's a kind of an unhistorical thing to say, but I would guess that a reporter dedicated to doing the job as fast as possible could have been in London by early on Tuesday afternoon, a day and a half before press. A day, I would say, pretty surely. Now, the reason that didn't happen is simple, and it's entirely human. It's not to do with technology. It's simple. Reporting had not been invented. The newspapers of 1815 were mainly what today would be called data aggregators. They assembled and published official court reports, verbatim parliamentary debates, government announcements, bankruptcy lists, extracts from interesting letters, shipping news, market prices, births, deaths and marriages, so forth. And with these went commentary that was often brilliant. Greatest writers of the day appeared in the papers. But it was strictly the work of people sitting behind desks in the Strand and Fleet Street. So by and large, journalists of that time were not people who got out there with their notebooks and asked questions. There are certainly examples of it happening, but they're rare and in many cases accidental. It would be at least the 1830s before British papers started to make a business of publishing original reporting of the kind we recognise. As I say, it had to be invented, or perhaps more accurately, it had to evolve. So, taken as a whole, the story of the news from Waterloo is shambolic. It's muddled, it's stumbling, it's unsatisfactory from every reasonable point of view, except perhaps an author's. It was the last really big international news to reach London without help from steam power or electricity. And looking back from an age obsessed with communications technology, it can be tempting to see it only in that light. You know, if only these people had had high-speed broadband. But it's good to be reminded that it's not just machines and software that make the difference. Even, well, that's true in a negative sense about the Waterloo was also the last really big international story to reach London without journalists to help it on its way. Nobody ever says that. In a more positive sense, I think what I took from this in terms of the being human thing is that it's a reminder, it's vivid proof that the force that pushes this whole business of news is that it's the same in Wellington's time as it is today. It's a human compulsion. And as Wellington himself would probably observe, it's not necessarily a rational human compulsion. You look at Dorothy Byrne's dance band, they're my benchmark in this. So great was their need to dash off and tell their friends the news that they gave up the free dinner she'd laid on for them. And very possibly their fee to boot. I don't imagine she chased them down to pay them. So, that's my take on being human in Waterloo. I think I've come in on time, which will surprise most people who know me. But I'm naturally very happy to take questions, and if in answering I refer to a book called The News from Waterloo appearing favour and favour in there. That's great, don't be surprised. But thank you very much for listening.